was a giant conflict between the North and the South over states' rights and the right to slavery. The North, also called the Union, was more liberal and had a manufacturing way of income. On the other hand, the South believed in slavery and relied on farming for income. They fought over which way of life was better. When the South finally couldn't stand the Union's attempts to ban slavery, so they receded from the Union to create their own nation called the Confederate States of America. The Union was led by President Abraham Lincoln and General Ulysses S. Grant, while the Confederate States were led by President Jefferson Davis and General Robert E. Lee. They fought for 5 years, from 1961 to 1965, until the South surrendered and slavery was banned in the U.S. It was the bloodiest war in U.S. history. After the Civil War, the U.S. had to rebuild their country. This was hard because the Union and the Confederate soldiers came back and had no jobs. Since all the jobs were filled, the economy suffered. This was a huge problem in the U.S.'s history. This fact alone caused even more problems in the U.S.'s future. After many struggles, the U.S. was able to rebuild their social structure and their surroundings. The Old West was a very important part of the U.S. history. There was a war on Native Americans in which the U.S. tried to eliminate the Indians' population in the country. After many battles, the U.S. put Native Americans on reservations where they still live today. This was also a period for mining. Mining was big for many years, but the main reason was the California Gold Rush. This was a period in U.S. history where the gold in huge amounts were said to be found in California, which made many people migrate west. Also, the train was invented. The train revolutionized travel. This invention made long-distance traveling easy for other people. Farming also grew popular in the U.S. After the migration to the West, the country entered a period of big business. This meant that the U.S. started to develop many more cities around the country. Many cities grew to be great cities that are still around today. This was when the U.S. started focusing on business. Before this period, government politics were not corrupt. This period was a time when the officials became corrupt with power. Many officials also became corrupt with money. These politicians made bad decisions which shaped the country in the wrong direction. There were a group of people called muckrakers who wrote about political corruption to inform the public so they understood what was happening. The U.S. made laws to try to help end political corruption. During the 1920s, there was an economic boom due to the invention of the car. Also during the 1920s, women fought for their right to vote. The government denied the women's right to vote because they thought women were not fit to vote. During the women's campaign of World War I began, which caused a huge problem for them. It became illegal to picket a wartime president, so many women were thrown in jail. Eventually, women got their right to vote. World War I was the first extremely large-scale war that included many countries and such bloody technologies. The war was fought by two sides, the Axis power and the Allied powers. The Axis power included Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. The Allied powers included France, Great Britain, and Russia. But at the last part of the U.S. war joined. World War I was initially caused by the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. When Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, a chain of declaring war started, and this happened. The Axis power, mainly Germany, started taking over all of Europe and some of Asia. The war in Europe lasted for 4 years, from 1914 to 1918, until the Axis power surrendered to the Allies and signed the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles attempted to crush Germany and punish them for the Great War. The Great Depression was the largest economic downfall in U.S. history. It was caused by overproduction in factories and the stock market crash of 1929, or Black Tuesday. People all around the country lost money, their investments, and from being laid off. 25% of the country was unemployed. That's 1 in 4 people out of work. At the same time, a large dust bowl in the Midwest caused people to lose their ability to farm and often starve to death. The Great Depression lasted from 1929 to the beginning of World War II in 1941. World War II started with the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in Germany. Hitler promised the retaliation of Germany and they could gain the land lost from the Versailles Treaty. Hitler turned Germany into fascist, totalitarian government. Along with fascist Italy and Japan, they started taking over all of Europe and Asia. The opposing superpowers were France, Britain, and the Soviet Union. The U.S. joined the war in 1941 when the Japanese bombed the U.S. naval base in Pearl Harbor. During the war, Germany was undergoing a genocide of Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, the mentally deficient, and anyone else that Hitler did not fit the Aryan race. This was known as the Holocaust. The war ended in 1945 with the fall of Germany and the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima by the U.S. It went from 1939 to 1945. The Cold War started at the end of World War II and was a competition between the U.S. and Soviet Union. The Cold War was mainly over which nation's way of life was better, the U.S. capitalism or the Soviet Union communism. One factor of the Cold War was the arms race between the two. The Soviets had isolated themselves and had began to develop the atomic bomb. Both sides had nuclear weapons and pointed at each other. The second factor was the hotspots. The Cuban Missile Crisis and the Korean and Vietnam Wars, which were very similar. For both wars, the communist North was trying to take over the capitalist South, and the U.S. stepped in and were forced to fight a gruesome guerrilla war. For Korea, after the war, it was divided once again at the 38th parallel. The U.S. simply pulled out of Vietnam, and the communists took over the South once again. The Cuban Missile Crisis was when the U.S. invaded Cuba because the Soviets attempted to hold nuclear bombs there. A third factor is the space race. The Soviets had developed the first satellite to go into orbit, but the U.S. later got a man on the moon and had technically won the space race. The final factor of the Cold War is the Berlin Wall, which divided Germany and did not allow anyone in or out. The wall fell in the 1990s, close to the time the Soviet Union fell. The U.S. won the Cold War, which lasted from 1945 to the 1990s.